Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer. So today, it's a little bit earlier this week. It's not Wednesday, it is Monday, but we have so many things I want to talk about that I don't know what the news cycle is going to be like later this week, so I want to get it done this Monday. And of course, the first topic I want to discuss, which I was actually recording when this happened last week, but Rush Limbaugh passed away last week on Wednesday at the age of 70 from lung cancer. And a lot of the audience probably have their own opinions. I think most of the comments I was getting in live time last week about Rush is that most people had a very positive opinion about Rush. People were very bummed out that he passed away. He's a very important voice for conservatism, the American right, big-time Trump supporter. And now there's a massive gap where he had hosted his show for 3 hours every day. No longer have any more Rush. Before Rush, there wasn't really a conservative media, and some people may be like, well, good, but despite a lot of the cringe and goofiness of conservative media, and a lot of conservative media is bad, not having conservative media is worse than the alternative of just everyone listening to CNN, NBC, and the major networks, New York Times, Washington Post for their news. It does offer an alternative for a lot of these people. And this is one of the best things about Rush is that he was an alternative for millions of Americans, is that, he had 15 million Americans listen to him every day. And these people otherwise could have just gotten their news from the nightly news and heard about, oh, look at how awful it is that the police murdered this innocent black man who was on his way to becoming an astronaut. And unfortunately, they killed him over, 2 cents in his pocket. And conservative media has been very good at, presenting the actual facts about these stories. I mean, we'd have probably never gotten the truth about Jussie Smollett without a lot of these conservative media outlets going in and being like, this is a hoax. Same with Trayvon Martin. Even though initially, I believe Rush Limbaugh thought that not Jussie Smollett, but Trayvon Martin had actually, he believed the real story. But, later on, he was one of the people who was presenting the real facts of the case. And there's several other examples of this. And it's just like from any topic you can imagine where the media already has like its interpretation, such as immigration. We're helping out these poor illegal immigrants who would never commit a crime, never do anything wrong. And this is just going to make our economy work even better if we give them amnesty. This is somebody, Rush Limbaugh and, other conservative media outlets were able to present an alternative. Is like, actually, it's going to be really bad if you pass amnesty. The same with gun control. If we listen to the mainstream media, you would think that crime would just end overnight with gun control. But thanks to people like Rush Limbaugh, you get the real facts that guns actually save lives. They actually help, and it's an integral part of our rights as Americans to be able to own a firearm. And this side of the story is never presented in the mainstream media. So a lot of people, I'll go into a little bit more further on this later on in the reactions to Rush Limbaugh's death. But this is something that people need to realize. I think a lot of our side think that, if we didn't have these people, they're just controlled opposition. And if we didn't have any conservatives on the radio, people would just be naturally disgusted by liberal media, and they would seek out, people further on the right, which, they're not on the radio and they're hard to find in the internet. Thinking of this in the 1990s when, he was at his peak of popularity. I mean, he was still popular by the time he passed away. But, people had this interpretation without Rush Limbaugh acting as controlled opposition is like these 15 million Americans would have become, white nationalists or something. Some people on our side always think that, or they would have actually been, fully anti-conservative nationalists who wanted to take back their government. I don't think that was in the cards there. So yeah, he was in. He benefited heavily from the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine, which was this stupid policy. This is really. I remember in the 2000s, people really wanted to bring this back during George W. Bush. Is that the Fairness Doctrine said that if you air anything on like radio or TV, you have to present the other side to counter it, and you have to give them equal time. And this is just such centrist stupidity where it's like we present rational opinions and we're all coming together to seek a logical endpoint to all these discussions. And it's like, well, if you have Rush Limbaugh for an hour, you then have to have Al Franken for an hour. That's like what the the fairness doctrine would have been. So people tried to dissuade a lot of their radio commentators from going into political commentary because they're like, well, if you're too, get too far into it, we're going to have to present the other side due to these stupid rules. And they got rid of it, and that allowed people like Rush Limbaugh to, thrive. Is that before he was just a standard news commentator or a radio presenter, and then he went into political and social commentary after the elimination of the fairness doctrine, which then helped, helped build the conservative movement for better or for worse. And I think in some ways that it gave people an alternative, because at this time in the 80s, you just had the you had the three major networks. CNN was just starting to get off the ground, but it was like not as big as it is now. I mean, it really took to the 90s for it to really become a big thing. And even then, it was still mostly news presenting rather than news commentary, even though it came from a pretty liberal perspective. All the major newspapers were liberal. I mean, they'd have several people putting this out in the remembrances, is that the only conservative columnist they read is George Will, and George Will is terrible. I mean, he was even terrible back in the 80s. Not really in a different opinion, as that he would just repeat liberal talking points in a different fashion. So this is what people had, and then Rush Limbaugh helped develop something different, and then that led to Fox News and what we have now. And a final point about the fairness doctrine is that they were talking about bringing it back in the 2000s because liberals, this is a very funny thought, is they thought that we were living under conservative domination, that there was like a theocracy happening under George W. Bush, and this is all due to talk radio and Fox News. And like, we have to have fairness doctrine so we can have liberal talk radio. And this is at the time when they were really trying to develop Air America, which was like the alternative, the libtard alternative to Rush Limbaugh. And they had like Janine Garofalo, and I'm wondering if some of my listeners remember Janine Garofalo. She was a famous actress at the time who has not been heard of in the past like 15 years, but she was like a big lib at the time, and Fox News hated her. But these are the type of people that they developed on Air America, but it was a total failure. No one wanted to listen to it because liberals don't need talk radio when they could just open up Washington Post, New York Times, or watch CNN. Or MSNBC was around in the 2000s. They could just turn on that and get all their news and information. Just the standard news that they hear on the nightly news, on the primary networks, was going to give them their worldview. So there was no reason for them to have talk radio, but they wanted to have this because they thought that talk radio and Fox News was too effective in the 2000s. So then one of the big questions we have to ask is, like, what was Rush Limbaugh's actual political ideology? What was his political philosophy? I mean, everyone calls him a conservative, but he had very populist style to it. I mean, most people noticed that before, conservatism was pretty boring. It was like William F. Buckley affecting, trying to pretend he was a WASP and talking in a funny manner on a PBS show. And that was not a populist style at all. That was not going to win over millions of Americans to the cause of conservatism. It was, very much trying to be as hard as an egghead, rather than a popular talk radio host. And so he really did have this way of just taking the ideology of National Review and, being really concerned with tax cuts and limited government, and portraying it in a way that could appeal to working class voters. And a lot of people, I think his main audience, was across the classes. I mean, you had middle class, working class, upper class, all listening to Rush Limbaugh. It is very much of a particular generation, is that many Gen Xers got into conservatism from Rush Limbaugh. I don't think many millennials, and certainly not many Zoomers, got into right-wing politics because of Rush Limbaugh, but many Gen Xers did. And of course, Boomers liked Rush Limbaugh because, well, he was a Boomer himself. So it was a certain age demographic that really had an attachment to Rush Limbaugh when, there was nothing at the time, and that they were still people who were listening regularly to radio. I guess people still listen to radio, or AM radio particularly, but he was able to offer them something that they had not heard before, especially from the radio. Rush's ideology changed over the years, and if you look at what he was in the 1990s, it was this very basic bitch kind of conservative who was emphasizing all these limited government and taxes, but he was engaged in some of the culture war stuff, and a lot of people turned, who listened in on Limbaugh were turning in because, they were upset about like the outrages that they were seeing around in like the 1992 LA riots, O.J. Simpson, affirmative action. And he did deal with his topics. And I think one thing you have to realize is that conservative movement was probably worse on some respects back in the 90s, particularly on trade, probably, and on immigration, even though there were a few, prominent restrictionists. On affirmative action, they were probably better because this was like a mainstream talking point. Bob Dole, before the 1996 presidential election, proposed a bill to eliminate affirmative action. And you could never imagine any Republican doing that today. Even though they will say that they oppose affirmative action, they couch it in terms of, oh, well, we're just defending Asians. We're so outraged that Asians aren't getting into Harvard that's the only reason we're mad about affirmative action. But denying whites jobs, qualified whites jobs and giving it to an unqualified minority, that was a mainstream conservative talking point. And Rush Limbaugh talked about that back in the day. I remember as a kid, I was like 7 or 8 and my parents were listening to it. And I could even, hear him talking about affirmative action and how, it's hurting whites. But on a lot of the topics that we still care about, he was not very good on. I mean, Peter Brimelow wrote in articles on VDare that, he went up to him and talked to him at these, dinner parties in the mid-90s, and he asked him about immigration, and Rush Limbaugh would get a very serious face and is like, I haven't made my decision on it. And he kept saying this throughout the 90s, and it was a big topic in the 1990s. I mean, the Barbara Jordan report came out. Barbara Jordan was a very prominent black Democrat. I think she was the first black woman to be elected to Congress, big-time civil rights icon, and she proposed this report that called for massive reduction in immigration to help out American workers. And Bill Clinton endorsed it. And there was a brief time period in 1995, 1996, where there was this window to get immigration restriction done. If Rush Limbaugh had endorsed it and had pushed for it, it may have likely passed and, we would have a better country today, but for whatever reason, it didn't support or endorse it. But there was a bill that Bill Clinton endorsed that Rush Limbaugh was active in helping pass, and that was NAFTA. This is one of the real unforgivable sins that Limbaugh was involved in, is that in the early 90s, he was a prominent advocate of NAFTA, and there was many conservatives who were not in favor of this. I mean, Pat Buchanan, of course, was opposed to it, and a lot of others who didn't even share, like Pat Buchanan's concerns about necessarily helping out American workers because, they're stereotypical idiotic conservatives. They still didn't like it because they thought it was going to undermine America's national sovereignty, which it did. And it also didn't help out our economy, and it didn't end immigration, which one of the advocates said that it would end most immigration from Mexico. Of course, that never happened. We're still having massive waves of illegal immigration from Mexico, even though it's been reduced over time. Most of our illegal immigration is coming from Central America. Proponents were still not correct in the end. And, but Rush Limbaugh was a prominent advocate of it. He argued with Ross Perot on national TV about it. And the Clinton White House thanked him as a distinguished American for helping pass this. And, Rush Limbaugh was a hardened Clinton foe. He was always promoting this stuff about every wrong thing that Bill Clinton was doing. But the Bill Clinton White House thanked him for helping pass NAFTA. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And even in 1996, when Pat Buchanan was running a very serious challenge for the presidency, in the Republican primary, Rush Limbaugh opposed Pat Buchanan in 96. Now, he supported him in 1992 when he ran against George H.W. Bush. And H.W. Bush was, of course, the incumbent president at the time. But he only supported Pat Buchanan as a protest vote, as a way of protesting George H.W. Bush raising taxes and, failing to uphold conservative orthodoxy. Well, in 1996, he opposed Pat Buchanan because Pat Buchanan was advocating for unconservative positions, such as demanding trade protection and wanting to end these free trade deals. And Rush Limbaugh was like, how could you do this? You can't. This is so unconservative. This is not conservatism. And he told his listeners at the time, I understand the anger behind these Pat Buchanan supporters, and the Republican Party needs to win them over. But I cannot stand his unconservative positions on trade. I don't. He didn't necessarily attack him on immigration and other things, but it was predominantly trade and a lot of these labor issues that he opposed Pat Buchanan on. So there was this stupid stuff involved. But over time, he's changed. And even in the mid to 2010s, right before Trump, he was opposing trade deals. He was not in favor of these globalist trade deals. He opposed TPP, in 2015. I remember that vaguely, or not vaguely. I remember that clearly, at the time, because I was at the caller, and he was very much opposed to TPP for the same reasons that Jeff Sessions was opposed to it. It was good. It was going to increase immigration. It was going to undermine national sovereignty. It was going to undermine American jobs. So he did realize NAFTA over time was a mistake, and he did show some regret for that. I don't know necessarily if that compensates for him helping pass it, but that's something to keep in mind. And he was in favor of Trump's tariffs on China, his trade wars, renegotiating NAFTA. So he did change on that subject, and he eventually came to make up his mind on immigration. And it was a way that was very close to, the dissident rights perspective, is that he was always talking about the threat of mass immigration and the threat it posed to American demographics, and how Democrats were weaponizing it to change our country so they could have a permanent electoral majority. And it was a threat to our culture, and it was sounding more like Pat Buchanan. And over time, he became a huge Pat Buchanan fan. I mean, there are segments where he highlighted how awesome Pat Buchanan's 1992 RNC speech was. He also highlighted Sam Francis on a show. Very few conservatives want to talk about Sam Francis. And for listeners who don't know who Sam Francis is, he was a prominent paleo-conservative thinker who, he helped out with Pat Buchanan's 1992 and 96 campaign, was an informal advisor. He got fired from the Washington Times for being, getting too woke on racial matters. But he was still one of the prominent conservative columnists at the time. It was a big deal that he got fired by the Washington Times, which was much more important then than it is now. And he, a lot of our, views and ideology, a lot of it comes from Sam Francis. So he was a very important person, and he helped with Pat Buchanan's Death of the West. A lot of that book is, Sam Francis's thinking. So if you ever want to, he has his own books out, but if you ever want to see his thinking, I would highly recommend picking up Pat Buchanan's Death of the West. So, and he was, Francis was, of course, excised from the conservative movement, becoming persona non grata. You can't mention him or praise him in any way if you want to be a respectable conservative. Well, in 2016, Pat Buchanan read an entire Sam Francis essay from 1996, on the air, and was highlighting about how this highlights, the Trump phenomenon that was going on in early 2016. And the whole essay was about, the rising up of middle American radicals, and how they're going to do something about this country. They're going to take it back. And it was very anti-globalism and anti-mass immigration and anti-liberal elite. And it's a very powerful essay. I think you should, I'm pretty sure you can find it online. It's called From Household to Nation. And you can, of course, find Rush Limbaugh's transcript on where he read it as well online. And I highly recommend people to do that. And the SPLC, of course, attacked Rush Limbaugh for doing that, but he didn't apologize or anything. So this does show that, this person who was in the 90s, a stereotypical libertarian-esque conservative who was always, really, obsessed with limited government and taxes. And then he changed in the 2010s. Even before Trump, it was not, necessarily Trump, signaled a change, is that he was already saying this stuff in 2014, 2015. And unlike a lot of prominent conservative commentators like Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly, who considered endorsing amnesty, Rush Limbaugh came out immediately and was opposed to it. And due to, him saying, I oppose this, don't vote for this, a lot of Republicans held the line in 2013 against amnesty. But unlike Sam Francis or Pat Buchanan, I don't think he could really articulate exactly how his, worldview was different from, the typical stale conservatism of National Review, or what he grew up with, that it was all emphasizing, tax cuts and limited government, zombie Reaganism, you would call it. And I think if you really want to know his political philosophy, it comes from this famous speech he did at 2009 CPAC. And I remember when the speech was on that this is like the biggest speech ever. I think I watched it live for whatever reason. I think CNN was covering it. It was on a Saturday, so they were showing it. And he was up on stage and he was like jumping up and down. He's like, ooh, ooh. And like everyone's like, yeah, this is going crazy. And, you know, throughout most of the 2000s, he was less relevant during the George W. Bush eras because he was just a cheerleader for George W. Bush. This is another unforgivable sin, or another serious problem with Rush Limbaugh is at the time he was like supporting, you know, the Iraq War, everything Bush was doing. And, you know, he had some personal issues at the time. He had to go to rehab for painkiller addiction. He got fired from ESPN for accurately saying that, you know, the sports media was obsessed with Donovan McNabb, who was a black Philadelphia Eagles quarterback. I almost said Philadelphia Phillies, not baseball, football. And he was the sports media was enthralled with Donovan McNabb because they were always wanting to have the great black quarterback. And he was briefly an ESPN commentator. And he merely pointed out that the sports media wants this black quarterback to succeed because they, you know, that's their desire. And he, of course, got fired from ESPN for that. But the fact that ESPN would hire Rush Limbaugh as a commentator, you know, indicates how far ESPN has fallen from the early 2000s. You know, I think even if somebody, you know, a friend pointed this out, that if even like a prominent ESPN personality offered like condolences on Rush Limbaugh's death, that person probably, depending on who they were, probably would not get fired, but they would have to offer apology and a clarification on offering condolences for Rush Limbaugh. Be like, well, I didn't know that he was a racist and sexist, but, you know, we should always remember that he died. You know, somebody on ESPN, an ESPN personality could not even remember Rush Limbaugh today, while in 2002, 2003, ESPN gave Rush Limbaugh a job. So that's one big difference between now and then. So after that brief digression, now back to the 2009 CPAC, which, you know, at the Tea Party, at the dawn of the Tea Party era, you know, Rush Limbaugh emerged as, once again, more relevant because, I mean, he no longer had to be a George W. Bush cheerleader. He was now, he could now be free to say what he wanted, and he was seen as the doyen of the Tea Party, is that he was the guy that they listened to, and he was articulating their worldview on a daily basis on his radio show. And so here's how he described his conservative philosophy. This is from his 2009 CPAC speech, which everyone covered at the time. When we look out over the United States of America, when we are anywhere, I almost want to do a Rush Limbaugh impersonation. I won't punish my listeners with that. When we see a group of people such as this or anywhere, we see Americans. We see human beings. We don't see groups. We don't see victims. We don't see people we want to exploit. What we see is potential. We do not look out across the country and see the average American, the person that makes this country work. We do not see that person with contempt. We don't think that person doesn't have what it takes. We believe that person could be the best he or she wants to be if certain things are just removed from their path, like onerous taxes, regulations, and too much government. And then he goes on to say about how conservatism believes in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and we take it as sacred dogma that all men are created equal by their creator. And, you know, it's like stereotypical conservative tripe. But this is like how he articulated, and this is like almost a problem with even like the good conservatives, you know, even like someone like Tucker Carlson, whenever they define like their natural political philosophy or like the basics of it, it gets into too much stereotypical conservatism. I mean, with Tucker, I think, you know, there was I think it was last year. I think it was in 2020 when he's defining like what the three things that, like the three principles the Republican Party should run on. And it was like very basic. I mean, it was stuff like you would support is like support for free speech and like equality, quality before the law, and everything that, yeah, you would theoretically support. But, you know, I think there's a little bit more like fundamental principles that you need to advocate for. And, you know, Rush Limbaugh was in the same case, that he really couldn't advocate for this position that, you know, we're conservatism, our right wing, our nationalism, We are fighting for the historic American nation, for the American people. That's how we define our nation. We define it through its people, not through these abstract values or, this piece of paper that has changed over the years. Yes, the Constitution is important to American identity, but what's more important is the people who wrote it. And we want to preserve those people and make those people better. That's what our philosophy should be like. And that's something that a lot of these people cannot fully speak. They cannot fully articulate for whatever reason. I think there's a few people who would be able to say this. I think Sam Francis, of course, was one. Pat Buchanan's another. But for whatever reason, a lot of these even very good conservatives won't say that. And whenever they revert back to we just believe in limited government and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So it's like, okay, great, but there's more to our worldview than that. So Rush Limbaugh was, of course, a very powerful man, despite, what was going on with whatever his cringe takes or cringe political philosophy that he was articulating. This is somebody who is very, I don't know if you could argue that there was anyone more important for the conservative movement over the last 30 years besides Donald Trump. People did compare him to Newt Gingrich. That's maybe, but, Newt Gingrich only had an influence in the 90s, didn't really carry over into the 2000s or later. And nobody, I don't think anyone did. And every Republican presidential candidate had to appease him and bow down before him. I mean, George H.W. Bush, when Rush Limbaugh was promoting Pat Buchanan's candidacy, George H.W. Bush invited him to the White House and allowed him to stay in order to win him over. Bob Dole reached out to him and made sure that he was supporting him. George W. Bush made sure that he was supporting him. George W. Bush offered a rare, no qualms aside, eulogy for Rush Limbaugh. Said he was a great American, etc., which, you would have imagined that George W. Bush in his redemption arc has to say that he was a racist and a sexist, but no, he acknowledged his support and thanked him for that. John McCain also had to reach out and support him. I mean, that's part of the reason that he made Sarah Palin his vice presidential candidate. He's thinking about the Rush Limbaughs and making sure that they were on his side. Mitt Romney made sure that he was on his side. And of course, Donald Trump had a very good relationship with Rush Limbaugh and went golfing with him even before he was running for president. So as somebody with a lot of power and a lot of influence. So of course he's going to inspire a lot of reactions when he dies. And most of the liberal media had offered, he made America worse. That was the message. I was listening to NPR the other day, and they had this guy, a feminine voice, and he was on there. He's like, and the host asked, well, what do you guys think about Rush Limbaugh? Do you think that we should, honor him in his death? And then this person's like, well, it's bad that his family is, grieving and stuff, and his family and friends, but ultimately I don't think we should honor him because he was such a corrosive aspect on our country, and I just don't think that we should honor someone like that. We have to remember the bad things they did, and this guy is just a radio talk show host. This isn't like a war criminal or a dictator. This is just a talk radio host. And of course, every liberal was sharing this position. I mean, if you read New Republic, Slate, Atlantic, they were all saying that he made America worse, or he made conservatism worse. And apparently the gist of this is that prior to Rush Limbaugh, nobody cared about politics, apparently. Politics was just not an issue. David French also wrote this in his article on Rush Limbaugh. As though everyone just got along and people would just come together and work things through. And this is a Cold War myth that American politics prior to some certain time period, they'll either say is the 80s or 90s or depending on how long people's memories are, because people have been saying this ever since the 60s. It was remember when people just got along and we got things done? People have been saying this for at least 50 years. And, I was recently watching a clip with Pat Buchanan on Face the Nation. All right, it was on Face the Nation from 1992. And the host, I was Bob Schieffer, was saying, oh, I have never seen a more partisan Congress than this. We need to get rid of this partisanship. And this is 30 years ago they were saying this stuff. And this is a common refrain that there's some magical period before where, it's well, you're conservative and you're liberal, but we're going to get down and have some drinks and we're going to hash out this bill to make do right by the American people. And the favorite myth is that Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, a liberal Democrat from Boston and this conservative firebrand from California, were able to come together and do things right for the country. And yeah, of course, you've had some of these examples before, but that was also depending, even like when you had that consensus, there was reasons for the consensus. That one, America was far more homogenous at the time. These guys, maybe they had differences, like one's from Boston, one's from California. There wasn't the grand chasm in values that you would see between someone like Ilhan Omar and Marjorie Taylor Greene. You don't really have that. You didn't have that before. And, politics, congressional politics at least, was probably less partisan. But, America had a lot of social turmoil and a lot of political unrest before. I mean, we were having riots in the 60s, real serious political violence, far more than we do today, in the 60s and 70s. And, there was all these issues that were going on. It wasn't necessarily that everyone was like coming together as neighbors and like nobody cared about politics. It's like, well, you believe in this and I believe in that, but it's not going to matter. It's like people have always like had issues over politics. I remember there's like some story I read in William Jennings Bryan biography. William Jennings Bryan was this populist Democrat who ran for president 3 different times in 96, 1900, I think 1908. And there was a story about these 2 neighbors who were best friends, and they always got along, didn't really discuss politics. But an 1896 election made them hate each other. That one supported Bryant, the other supported McKinley, and they just couldn't like each other anymore. And so we've always had this. And even if you look at our history from the Revolution to the 1877 compromise, we had extreme violence, like people like were beating each other, trying to kill each other, assassinations, or attempted assassinations, and even like people, politicians had to worry about mobs actually coming to their house and like trying to kill them if they took a position that the people didn't like. Robert E. Lee's father was nearly killed by an anti-federalist mob in 1812 over the War of 1812 for opposing it. There was there was like far worse violence and far worse partisanship then. But we imagined that, prior to, our horrible time period, that there was none of this, that everyone just got along, and that Rush Limbaugh came and made everything corrosive. It's like, no, he was just speaking to millions of Americans who were discontented with, the consensus, what the establishment was feeding them. And he merely offered them, a valve to express their opinions, or to somebody's like, what, I agree with this. So these people had natural discontent. It wasn't necessarily a radio talk show host making them angry. And like, if it wasn't for Rush Limbaugh, they would have actually just gotten along with their, crazy liberal neighbor who wants their kids to change gender. I don't think that was going to happen. Or that these people wouldn't notice that there were things wrong with affirmative action if it wasn't for Rush Limbaugh. That wasn't the case. He was merely responding to his audience and speaking for his audience. But this is what they all said, and this is because liberals generally want to be the only politics in town, and they want this one-party rule where everyone comes together. And then it's the pretense of democracy is that, we disallow certain extreme points of view, and this is like we keep seeing this in the post-Trump era, is that we allow certain dissent, and it's over like maybe tax rates or maybe different healthcare policy, or some topics. But there's some topics we can't disagree on, such as like mass immigration. You have to think it's the greatest thing ever. Affirmative action, you have to think it's awesome that all these blacks need this help. Black Lives Matter. There can be no disagreement about this. Like, black people are being genocided by police officers. We can't discuss this. You can't dissent from this. So they have these parameters of talk that we have to fit into, and if you're outside of it, then that's somehow corrosive to our body politic. That this is a danger to our threat to our democracy is their favorite line that they love to offer, and this happens with Rush Limbaugh. So this is a fantasy that was promoted heavily after his death, that somehow he made America worse, which. Every media outlet's saying it, and it does show that we no longer want to offer any condolences to the dead. I mean, I remember when Jesse Helms died. He was this fire-breathing conservative senator from North Carolina who was a segregationist. CBS and all these major outlets were like, in remembrance, in memoriam of Jesse Helms. Like, today they'd be like, they would have like good riddance, like racist, like die. I hope you died in pain. This would be like the CBS nightly news, especially compared on how they're treating Rush Limbaugh. But I think what might be even more interesting is how some conservatives remembered Rush Limbaugh. Most conservatives were, actually sad to see Rush Limbaugh go, unlike liberals who couldn't contain their glee and were always saying that Rush Limbaugh made America worse. So most conservatives were saying this, but there were many conservatives who were saying that, Rush Limbaugh made conservatism worse. Or that Rush Limbaugh betrayed conservatism by supporting Trump. So those are like kind of two critical responses of it. And I think, indicative of this was our op-ed that came from Ross Douthat, who's the New York Times resident conservative. He generally writes interesting stuff, but he is like a spiritual cuck. I mean, he always goes to the finish line. It's like, why didn't he just say this nicer? And even though Ross Douthat agreed with most of Trump's agenda, he couldn't support Trump because, well, I mean, it would have cost him his job to support Trump. But, that's not the stated reason. I mean, it's because of, well, principles or his lack of character, as most people say. He's in line with this, almost in line with this concept of what I refer to as sinecure conservative, but I'll go into that in a moment. Anyway, Ross Douthat's op-ed, he went on, he's like, he complained that Ross Douthat built this alternative media universe that made conservatism worse, that it made that more powerless to change things because it was just operating within its own ghetto, and that really without Rush Limbaugh, we would have been interacting in the New York Times column pages, that somehow without Rush Limbaugh, the New York Times opinion page would publish nationalist and Pat Buchanan, or Buchananites, and this would have actually changed policy, not Rush Limbaugh, because it just kept conservatives from not interacting with the larger public. And what we really needed was these optimistic evangelists like Ronald Reagan, which Dan McLaughlin of National Review, who's baseball crank, he's the guy with the screaming baseball with his face and transplanted on a baseball and it's screaming, that guy. I'm sure you've seen him on Twitter. The Chapo Trap House people have made his Avi one of their symbols because it's so stupid. He also was making the same thing. It's like he was once a happy warrior and he had Reaganite optimism, but now that's all gone. And for some reason, the answer to everything is Reaganite optimism, the shining city on the hill, and everything's going great as long as we cut taxes. And it's a mythology that even someone like Ross Douthat, who is not a Reaganite, who's criticized Reagan, he doesn't like this zombie Reaganism that continues to fester, continues to carry on. He even will say that, the fact that we built this alternative media ghetto has made us more negative and only speak to ourselves, which if we had just interacted with the rest of the media, we would be able to convert, 55% of this country, is that he used in this article, saying in the 80s and 90s, 55% of America was conservative, and now it's more like 45%, and it's due to this conservative media alternative. And he also says that, this media universe created by Rush Limbaugh made them, conservatives powerless to stop. It actually hindered their ability to stop things that would have happened. And I don't really agree with that. I think, there is like a common right-wing talking point to say that conservatives are conserve nothing. And, well, if you're looking from cultural positions, yes, that's true. But I mean, they're not necessarily fighting a cultural battle. It's fighting a war in the political sphere. And it's not like you're going to expect Republican lawmakers to determine what type of TV programming is on MTV or CBS or whatever. They're not necessarily in charge of that, or what movies are going to be produced. But when it comes to political victories, I think, without conservative media, I think we would have had gun control. I think we would have had even more aggressive version of affirmative action. I think, even from the abortion perspective, like people want to say, well, yeah, they've done nothing on abortion, but I don't know if that's necessarily true. There's all these states, there's at least a dozen states, probably more, where it's fairly difficult to get an abortion. I mean, in most deep southern states, it's like there's like only like a handful of abortion clinics open. Like it's not easy to get an abortion, and this is due to a lot of the efforts made by the pro-life movement. And conservatives. And yes, it hasn't rolled back Roe v. Wade or other decisions made by that, but that's in a lot of ways that's due to this. This is not necessarily the majority position on abortion. I mean, if you look, I've said this before in the podcast. I mean, this is a little bit of digression. I'm going to keep this brief. Over 60% of America believes abortion should be legal in most cases, but in a lot of these states, in the deep South and in the plains, they've made abortion effectively illegal in most cases due to how difficult it is. So that is that is a victory of some sorts. And there's also been a victory on taxes. And yes, people roll their eyes like, who cares about taxes and regulations? Yes, there's been victories on that front, which was a much greater focus of conservatives than anything dealing with immigration or the issues that we actually care about. But if you focus on the issues they care about, they've had victories on that. And I think even without them, things could be far worse now. People want to say, well, I don't know about that. It's like, yeah, we're now just seeing this acceleration, in the last 6 years or so, I think starting with the second term of Obama and, some things were briefly halted by Trump from a policy perspective, but, I think we could see many worse. And also the worst thing is that the vast majority of people would accept it. The people who are listening to Rush Limbaugh, a lot of people think that those 15 million or so people, they would still be rock-ribbed conservatives. They'd still be fighting for the cause. It's like, no, I think a lot of those people would be liberal because they would just listen to whatever's on the radio station and it's liberals telling them, or whatever's on TV and it's liberal commentators. And they would just accept what's told to them. If they're not told that there's an alternative, they're just going to accept it because they're going to see it's like hopeless to change anything. There's hopeless to challenge anything. Nobody thinks like I do. So I'm just going to follow along with the crowd. Like, this is how most people operate. And if they're not given an alternative, they're just going to follow along and it's going to make things worse. So, and if you look at a lot of things that are going on in the 70s, I mean, it wasn't like necessarily like the 70s or, the post-68 era was like really conservative. I mean, there was a lot of left-wing, radical left-wing ideas that were proposed that could have passed if it wasn't for conservative resistance. And there's always this trajectory that somehow we've, it is accepting a lot of left-wing framework that we're on this path that it's just increasingly getting more left-wing and progressive, and there's really nothing we can do about this except for not have conservative media and just talk about these issues in the New York Times column pages, which somehow that would really change the world. I don't like to accept that framing. There's like some things that have gotten worse there's some things that have gotten better. Gun policy, I think, is one, even though, yeah, they're going to try for gun control again. But, it's far more likely that they're going to get gun control in the 70s. And they were looking to ban Saturday night specials and other forms of handguns, not just what they term assault rifles. And I don't think anyone tries to ban handguns now, which, is a victory of sorts. And even the National Rifle Association in the 70s, before it was taken over by, solid Second Amendment supporters, was in favor of gun control. So, there are, developments in our direction, and there are some that are not. Yes, it's mostly gone in a negative direction, but not everything has been a loss and defeat. And I think accepting this framework, accepts the left's worldview that everything is just progressing in their direction, and there's nothing you can do about it, and it encourages defeatism and blackpilling. And I don't really, as most of my listeners should know, I don't encourage that. So that's one thing to say. With Douthat's article, it was like really stupid. It's like, oh, if we just pleasantly, talk about these issues. And he also cited Newt Gingrich, who made Congress more partisan, which I actually think, Newt Gingrich sucks, but I think actually making Congress more partisan is actually good because most examples of bipartisanship screw over America. Amnesty is a bipartisan idea in 1986, and in many cases, up until now, was a bipartisan idea. Terrible. War, bipartisan. Iraq War got bipartisan support. Criminal justice reform, another bipartisan idea. Terrible. Most bipartisan ideas are a threat to the historic American nation, and we should oppose them. So we don't want more bipartisanship because our situation would be even worse now. Like gun control could have been a bipartisan idea, but thanks to partisanship, it was never passed. And people need to consider this. Another article that I criticized in this the writer actually hit back at me for criticizing it was Michael Brennan Doherty's article on Rush Limbaugh, which was like saying that like, well, millions of people found him alienating and didn't like him because, you know, they didn't like his tone. They want to read Roger Scruton. And Roger Scruton is a British conservative philosopher. I don't really want to criticize him too much. I found everything he wrote boring, and it's not necessarily because like, oh, I'm too stupid to read this. It's just like airy, platitudes, and just like it's really just trying to sit above things. And I mean, some of the things he wrote was interesting. I don't think the dissident right would disagree with much of what he said. And coming from a philosophical perspective, like Scruton was probably better than Rush Limbaugh. But I think Rush Limbaugh was more important and offered this alternative to millions of Americans, or millions of people rather, while Roger Scruton, was probably only read devotedly by a few thousand people. He had a lot of respectability, and he had, a certain academic prestige, but, he was not influencing millions of Britons, and like in the same way that Rush Limbaugh was influencing millions of Americans. So I would say that Rush Limbaugh is more important. And it was probably better that boomers listened to Rush Limbaugh than read Roger Scruton, because I think a lot of Americans who read Roger Scruton become incredibly cringe, like Michael Brennan Doherty, who is, over 300 pounds and really ugly and has this stupid handlebar mustache. And he's like a very low T guy. If you want to watch, you should go look on YouTube his interviews, like video interviews where he's sitting down in a chair with Tucker Carlson. And Tucker Carlson is just like has all this high T and energy. And it's like clearly like seeing him as like the submissive man who's just like, haha. And he's like really like awkward around him. It's very much you're seeing high T and low T in action when you're seeing that. So I encourage my listeners to look that up. But his whole article was like saying we need like a more intellectual conservatism and etc. But I mean, that's not how you win over the millions of people. Millions of Americans are not going to go for Roger Scruton or this like, or Russell Kirk or Edmund Burke. They're not going to read this stuff. I mean, actually in Pat Buchanan's 1992 RNC speech, he made this point. It's like, these people may not be leaving Edmund Burke, but they're on our side. They're conservatives of the heart. And Rush Limbaugh connected with them, not Roger Scruton, or not anyone in National Review like Michael Brennan Doherty is at. And that's something to keep in mind. And, a lot of these people just don't like it because it's like a threat to their respectability. And Michael Brennan Doherty was like Ross Douthat, somebody who agrees with pretty much all the positions that Trump had. And he, opposed him because of character or principles. It's like, yeah, and you're at National Review and you're like being friends with all these people who are terrible, who don't share your ideas. And if you notice, like, all the people are liking it because he's getting all these arguments with people. He even shot back at me when I said, boomers, it's better that boomers listen to Limbaugh than read Scruton. He's like, oh, you're just some fashy queen trying to groom boys, or you're a fed. I don't know what you are. And like, Doherty knows who the fuck I am. He follows me on Twitter, and he's just like, repeating these lines that these certain people always say that like everyone in the distant right must be gay or something. And it's like, I think you should look into your own side more of some of these paleo-conservatives, respectable paleo-conservatives, and you'll wonder what's going on there. But, they always impute this, and it's always like a fed. So it's like a deflecting from the position. But if you were looking at everyone who's liking his tweets and stuff, it's all these like horrible liberals at the Atlantic, like Adam Swerwer, or Dave Weigel at the Washington Post. It was not any real conservatives. It's like, yeah, it's like these horrible liberals who think that conservatism just amounts to white supremacy really want an intellectual conservatism. No, they don't. They just want a hapless challenger that accepts whatever is going on, and then they merely scurry into their hobbit holes and read like some Roger Scruton book, but they present no threat to the liberal hegemony. And that's what they want. And Doherty is much more that I think Ross Douthat, a part of this trend or thing that I call sinecure conservative, is that a sinecure conservative is a conservative commentator whose whole overarching mission is to ensure that nothing they say risks their income or their reputation or their respectability. And not Ross Douthat, but Michael Brennan Doherty is much like this, or we should call him Michael Brennan Dowie. Dowie has admitted all the time that he will not write things that will risk his income, or he will not work in a place that, he could lose his income. And it's like, well, that's not necessarily a heroic attribute. And you're supposed to be speaking truth to power as a columnist. And instead, you're just saying, I want to ensure that my gravy train keeps rolling. And it's not even making that much money either. It's probably making less than $100,000 a year. It's not necessarily, and he's also, from what people have told me, his salary at National Review is paid for by the Koch brothers, or the Koch brother network. So that's reportedly, allegedly, that's what I've heard, because they wanted somebody who was a critic of foreign interventionism there, and so that says a lot about it. That's definitely a sinecure conservative. Ross Douthat, I wouldn't necessarily say that is, because unlike Doherty, or Dowie, he's at the New York Times and he's introducing new ideas and concepts in a newspaper that's read by millions, and it's going to spur public debate. Like, nothing that Dowie writes is going to spur public debate, but everything that Ross Douthat writes is going to spur public debate. And I don't necessarily like Douthat, but I think he's far more interesting than Dowie. Dowie is like a dollar store general, is a dollar store version of Ross Douthat, and he's not spurring public debate over ideas that are central to the dissident right, or ideas that liberals aren't going to talk about. And people always do try to get him fired because of what he writes. So he does actually he does risk his income through his writing. So I don't really want to say he's a sinecure conservative, but he does stay within the perimeters set by his liberal bosses. The two biggest examples I would say are Jonah Goldberg and Matt Lewis, in that Matt Lewis isn't that important. I worked with him at the Daily Caller, but I remember this indicative moment from 2016 when there was an office worker who wasn't necessarily pro-Trump, but was saying like positive things. It's like, well, the supporters, are angry and they have like a right. And a lot of this, what they say, has a point. And Matt Lewis lashed out. He was extremely angry. He's like, you would dare say anything good about Trump? He wants to eliminate my job at CNN. He will arrest me and put me in jail. So you essentially want me to be homeless, right? You want me to lose my job because you're saying nice things about Trump. So the whole point of his political ideology is how he can keep his like CNN contributorship. And that's it. That's like his whole political ideology, and everything centers around that. And that for you to say anything nice about Trump is to threaten his sinecure. And that is outrageous, because you're thus calling for him to be homeless. And Matt Lewis has gotten all these, book deals and stuff that he shouldn't have. He had this big book, and well, it wasn't a really big book because it was a dud, but it was heavily touted by the media, and he got a lot of coverage over it in 2015. Or it was actually released in early 2016, Too Big to Fail, which was a criticism of conservatism for a way that like liberals would like Salon, like publish excerpts of it. And it was like saying like how stupid Tea Partiers were, but then it easily applied to Trump afterwards. But the book didn't sell anything, but he got probably like a nice advance for it because it was telling liberals what they wanted to hear. And so everything he writes at Daily Beast and stuff, it's nothing that's going to offend his audience. And it's something that could say, well, I'm a good conservative and you should give me a fellowship. And there's nothing offensive I'm going to say. And Jonah Goldberg is probably, I think in some ways, the worst example, because he has an AEI fellowship. And anyone who has an AEI fellowship is definitely the definition of a sinecure conservative. So Tim Carty would be another person. Even though I think Charles Murray has an AEI fellowship, but I wouldn't put him in there because he actually does say risky and offensive things. But for most part, yes, most of the people who have AEI patronage are in the sinecure conservative. But if you look at Jonah Goldberg, like Jonah Goldberg has always said, never taken a position that it will be too offensive or too extreme or something that would cost him his USA Today column. And it's always like, well, I think there's so much extremism on both sides, but why can't we come to the center? And everything, like every article comes to that, and any position that's like on conservatism that may offend liberal audience, he'll just like entertain it. But then he won't endorse this. There's a great hit piece on him from, I think, like 2012 or 2013 by Alex Perrine, who's a horrible leftist. But this article is still pretty good. It was published at Salon. And it notes like how he he'll never go too far into ideas that like liberals find offensive, like gay marriage. Like he'll be, he won't say anything that we should like totally oppose it. but he'll like, oh well, they have a point, but I don't personally, think that way. And he goes along with this for everything. Nothing he says is going to be something that's going to cost him. And this is the definition of sinecure conservative, and that's how you keep your AEI fellowship. So this is a real problem with Conservative Inc. I think far more than the grifters are a problem, but far more than people like Rush Limbaugh, who are offering what people kept criticizing as infotainment, is like, yeah, but that's how you win over millions of people to your side. If you're entertaining and exciting, then they're gonna pay more attention to you than some boring guy who's writing some 8,000 word long essay about some like English legal history. They're not going to pay attention to that. They're going to pay attention to what somebody like Rush Limbaugh is saying. And I think the infotainers are far better than the sinecure conservatives, who may read more books or may say things nicer, but at the end they pose no threat to liberal hegemony, and they're ultimately controlled opposition due to the sinecures that they're so obsessed with obtaining and keeping, but that's all they're about, versus somebody like Rush Limbaugh, who will take risks and will engage in controversial subjects that may cost him his radio job, but he will say it anyway because that's what his audience wants to hear, and it's the truth. So yes, as I would say, it's better that people listen to Rush Limbaugh than read Michael Brennan-Dowie. So that's the conclusion I want to say about Rush Limbaugh. I've got a few subjects I want to run through quick. I don't want to give too deep of treatment of this because, it's already close to an hour here, and I don't like to bore my listeners with more than an hour, but this will go over a little bit longer. So there's two big news items I want to run through before I get to the Patreon questions. One, Biden's amnesty bill was released last week. It is terrible. That's the short summary. It will legalize millions of illegals. It will bring back illegals who are deported by Trump and legalize them and offer them a pathway to citizenship. And the pathway to citizenship is a joke. They don't even have to pay back taxes or pay fines like past amnesties. They literally just have to wait 8 years, get a wait 5 years to get a green card, and then after 3 years they can actually apply for citizenship. It's a total joke, and it's going to increase immigration because it's going to loosen all these family reunification policies. So now the whole family can come over, and they're increasing the diversity visa lottery cap, and they're increasing the caps on guest worker visas. So it's going to screw over American workers. And there's literally nothing in there that's going to invest more in border security. So there's nothing in there that's going to obtain Republican support. The good news is that it's not going to. I don't think it's going to pass. Every news article said it's not going to pass. There's zero Republican support for it. I think the only two Republican senators who may back it are Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, and they're not going to eliminate the filibuster because both Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, or at least two Democrats, don't want to eliminate the filibuster. So, and even Sinema and Manchin may vote against this amnesty as well. So I think it's dead on arrival. We'll talk more about it as Congress debates. The real threat is that they may split it off into pieces, and some of those bills may pass, such as a limited amnesty for dreamers who are illegal aliens who came to America as minors, or even a farm worker amnesty. Those are the things we have to worry about, but we'll cover that more in depth as it's debated in Congress. And the second issue I want to address real quickly is there was a march in New York City over the weekend, and it was a Unite Against White Nationalism march that was done by Asians to protest all the attacks that are going on Asians, and they blamed white nationalists. The problem with that is every attack has been done by a black person. It's like, if you look at the Bay Area, it's like every person is like, the person they wanted justice for was this 84-year-old Thai man who got sucker punched as he's walking outside of his garage, and it was sucker punched by a black kid. And the black guy, they don't even show this guy's face in news media. They just show the back of his head. I think that's because, California no longer shows mugshots. Wonder why. But you can clearly see he's black. He's not a white nationalist. But Asians are, instead of addressing the real problem and seeing yes, this is caused by black criminality and we want law and order, they're instead, this is caused by racism and we want hate speech laws. We want to unite with the black community that's attacking us. And, the real problem is white people and Donald Trump. And this is once again showing that Asians don't want to break off from the people of color coalition. They want to stay solidly within it because they know that's how they gain power and status. And they know that it's going to hurt them if they, decided that they want tougher policing. If they want, and there's some, not all Asians are doing this. Like a lot of Asians are forming community patrols and trying to protect their old people. That's an admirable thing to do. But a lot of their advocates who are out in the media are saying the real problem, we're not going to support over policing because that hurts our black brothers and sisters. We're instead going to, stand up against hate and white supremacy, which white nationalists now serve as this like boogeyman threat that the only way we can have tougher crackdown is by pretending that all the crime is committed by white nationalists. And this happened during the Minneapolis riots over George Floyd, is that the governor, clearly it was done by Antifa and BLM. There was no white nationalists around. And said they concocted this myth that was started by white nationalists. And they did this so they could order like the National Guard and state police to crack down on it, because they can't crack down on it if it's blacks and leftists doing it. So they have to, envision this white supremacist menace as behind all this crime and violence in order for us to do this thing. And then we're now seeing this with, the Capitol protests, and compare it with the numerous Antifa and BLM riots, which was greeted with a shrug and, no federal investigation of any of these crimes. Meanwhile, we're told that white supremacists are the number one terror threat in our country due to the Capitol protests. Meanwhile, everyone ignores Antifa laying siege to the Pacific Northwest for nearly a year, and Black Lives Matter calling billions of dollars of damage through their riots. And so this is the world we live in, that, the only villain we can have in our society today is the white nationalists. And it's like, I don't like necessarily using McCarthyism, because McCarthyism was kind of there. It was good for the most part. I don't think it was unreservedly good. There's still some qualms with it, but this is like the 1950s, where everything that bad we had to attribute to communists. Well, now everything bad we have to attribute to white nationalists, and this is the new era we live in. So this is the new McCarthyism, but instead of being good, it's bad. So those are the two things. Both those subjects I'll talk more with in depth as the time goes on. But first, I want to now move on to our patron questions. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions on Highly Respected if you sign up for the Patreon option at Highly Respected's Patreon. So the first question we got, and it's about our traveling friend, Ted Cruz. It comes from Tim. He asks, Scott, what do you think about Ted Cruz's Cancun trip? And this was like one of the biggest stories last week, and it's not even really a news story. It's like, I don't care about it. If you were a senator, if you were any person that had means and your whole family was freezing in your house and they're complaining and they're whining and they're like, I'm cold, we have no power, this sucks, why are we staying here? And then you have to tell them, well, Heidi, I think his wife's Heidi. It's like, well, it's bad optics if I leave, so we have to stay and freeze. They're not going to like Ted. They're not going to like their dad or husband for doing that. Maybe you shouldn't have gone to Cancun. It was not good optics because, people are blaming their leaders for this energy crisis going on through this ice storm. Clearly, the infrastructure in Texas sucks. I think a lot of it's caused by the cheap materials they use for these houses. These houses are built cheap, poorly, and that's why their pipes burst in like 15-degree weather, which nobody would think that would happen anywhere far north. They have like sub-zero temperatures, and any time that like temperatures I guess dip into the 20s, their pipes burst in Texas, or their house collapses. This is not how houses are supposed to be. But it's also the power, the energy grid. It's like the whole thing. It wasn't just the wind turbines. It's like everything froze. And like to have to say is like, how did this happen? Like, why did Republicans allow this to happen? So Ted Cruz is a senator. It's not necessarily his job to he could show like he's doing stuff. He could have helped, shovel snow for the optics. But I guarantee you that he did this because his whole family was complaining. And he's like, okay, I'm going to be a good dad. I'm going to be a good family man. I'm going to take them on a nice trip to Cancun where it's warm and they don't have to be frozen. Probably Probably should have realized that was a bad idea. Maybe he should have just sent his family along while he just stayed and froze. But I don't really care. But I would say this about the ice storm: it is going to hurt Republicans going forward. I think this may, in 2022, if people still have a memory of it, and people probably will, because this has affected pretty much every Texan in some way. I mean, maybe not every Texan had their power out, but they knew somebody with their power out. So millions of Texans had their power out. They remember freezing for a day or more than that, and maybe their pipe burst or they had no running water, and then they had water, they had to boil it, but no power. So I don't know how the hell they're going to do that. So especially their gas is connected to their electricity, So this is what they're having to do in Texas. So I think Republicans may pay a heavy price in 2022. Ted Cruz is not up for election. None of the senators are, but some of the congressmen are, or all the congressmen are, and they're going to have a gubernatorial election. And this could play very poorly for them going forward. So, people always want to talk about demographics turning Texas blue, but maybe incidents like this showing incompetent leadership could do that very well. And I think this may end Greg Abbott's presidential hopes, depending on how much blame he has. I don't necessarily see if the blame has been directed at Greg Abbott, but I think it will slowly, the anger will build up against him. And like, if you're looking at like leadership examples of like, wow, we want this person to run our country, they're going to look at the ice storm of like how his whole state collapsed due to, 20-degree weather and an inch of snow. So they're going to see this as like, maybe we don't want this person in charge of our country. So yeah, the Ted Cruz Cancun trip, getting really mad about it, like, oh, I can't believe he did this. It's like, I don't care, but I do. It's bad optics, obviously. He probably should have froze, but I think it was right for him to send off his family. I mean, if you had the means, of course you would send your family out of the state. Like, why wouldn't you? And if you were not a politician, you would follow along with them. So, I understand his reasoning. I don't really care. It's fine. It's just another stupid thing that Ted Cruz did, and not good optics. But that's the last word on it that I would have to say. And GOP should be worried about the ice storm. But that's it for that question. And now for our final question, and it has nothing to do with politics, but it's a very controversial take I had. It does have to deal with a controversial take I shared on Twitter. This question comes from Ryan. He asks, Scott, why do you hate Slipknot? I had a tweet over the weekend where there's this funny account I show as like old meme archive, which has all these funny memes from like the 2000s and early 2010s. And it had some meme about like this boy band. It's like, this is the boy band, best band in the world. And it's like, and then it has a image of Slipknot playing live. It's like, isn't there someone you forgot to ask? And like implying that Slipknot's the best band in the world. And like, I think boy bands are more. I think if you look at like NSYNC or Backstreet Boys, if they come on the radio, it'd probably be a more enjoyable listening experience than Slipknot. And people are like, well, Scott, you like metal. Why don't you like Slipknot? Well, Slipknot is new metal, NU, not in EW metal. And as I said in my podcast with Thomas, it's no longer new because it's over 25 years old. And Slipknot itself, I think their first album came out like 25 years ago. So they're not a new band at all, but if you look at their like music, it's like terrible. It combines like hip hop with like hard rock, and a lot of the rhythms are like hard rock. I hate their image. They're all in like jumpsuits and masks, and there's like 9 members. There's no reason to have 9 members. They have like 2 percussionists, but there's no reason to have 2 extra percussionists because like the job's already being accomplished by the drums. It's just like adding additional noise to the music. And if you ever watch them in live, like the 2 percussionists are just jumping up and hopping up and down, and it's like stupid. And you're like, why are they doing this? And like the whole stage presence is dumb. And so they have 2 additional, and of course they have like a DJ and a mix and a dude on samples. Other unnecessary additions to the band. I mean, a band shouldn't be more than like 6 members. Maybe they can have like a keyboardist or stuff. So that's one problem with it. I hate their image. It is, very cartoonish. It's very like silly. And it's like, and they're very much wiggerish. I didn't like their aesthetics and stuff. And if you look at all their lyrics, it's like, oh, I'm mad because I'm mad about something. And you want to be like, well, metal's supposed to be aggressive, but it has like lyrics that deal with like fantasy, horror, the occult. It has like, like a deep message, but this is like all the lyrics are just like some guy's like, oh, I had a bad day, I'm mad, and then like that's like it's just like really stupid low common denominator. And if you listen to their non-album tracks, they're absolutely horrible because there's like no like melody or like to them. It's just like, and there's not a strong emphasis on riffs and Slipknot because it's like a new metal band and it's vocally driven and the vocals suck because it's like this guy and he's like whispering and then he's like yelling and then he's like going in and he's like and then like it's like all driven by the vocals. It's not driven by the riffs like most normal metal. And like, yeah, the riffs suck. I mean, like, I can't even tell you like the riffs because the riffs have no defining character. And I would say like the radio singles that they put out, like Left Behind or Duality or Psychosocial, which was a big song when I was in high school. I remember that album came out in 2008 and everyone was like Psychosocial. But it's like all those songs, it's building up to the singers. I think Corey Taylor is his name. Corey Taylor, his melodic vocals in the chorus, and then it's like got a stupid riff throughout the verses, and that riff's just written, and it's just like really simplistic. It's really stuck to a formulaic modern rock song structure that's not particularly interesting. And like all the stuff they like, oh, they've got experimental stuff, and it's like, yeah, but it's like just like an additional bit of noise done in like the chorus or something, but it doesn't really add anything to the music. And yeah, new metal is just like terrible. Like if you listen to new metal still, I have to doubt your respectability, especially if you still listen to like Slipknot. It really, somebody made a joke that I think Irku Tannen, who's been on the show, made is like Scott antagonizes millennial C students, C minus students, which is like true. That's like who would have listened to Slipknot, and it's like very much something for like middle school kids. If you're like in 2004, you would have been like, this is cool. But if you grow up and like listen to better metal, like, I don't know, Slayer, Sepultura, stuff that like, bands that they were ripping off or bands that they were really recycling their riffs. And that's like way better. There's like the riffs are important. The vocals are less annoying. It's not vocally driven, even though they may have harsh vocals. And it's just a much more enjoyable experience. And there's like something like progressing in the music. It's not stuck into just like a very standard formulaic rock song structure, which every, Slipknot song is. And it's just a build up to the guy's melodic vocals like in the chorus. And, there's no emphasis on riffs. So it's very bad metal, very cringe band image. And this is coming from somebody who enjoys black metal and everyone's in corpse paint and spiked gauntlets and bullet belts. But that's based, corpse paint and spikes and leather based, matching jumpsuits with stupid masks, cringe, blue pilled, not good. So that's my opinion on Slipknot. Please don't listen to them. If you still do, I urge you, please, for the love of God, do not listen to Slipknot. They're terrible, bad influence on metal, and just like cringe all around. So please don't listen to them. And I guess that's going to be my final note for today. So I may have another episode this week to go into different subjects. Depends on what happens to the news. But be kept in touch. If I don't, it probably will come out next Monday, the next episode. So keep an eye on that. So until next time, stay respected.